So now I'm at the Thomas Owens house in historic Savannah. I think the interesting aspect is that his descendants donated this house thinking, that the grandeur of the house would be displayed to the public for all of times. But how much has changed in the last 150 years. So this house has almost become a historical significance for the slaves that lived in here, and the economic divide and the concept of how unfair life was between the rich and the enslavers and the enslaved women and helpers and all of that. I think, just to recap, and it's mind-blowing how the descendants wanted this house to be portrayed to show their power and grandeur, but then it really almost turned on them entirely and turned into showing almost how unfair the system was. But it's an interesting house. It is a beautiful house, and this tour does talk about some of the engineering behind it, some of the design styles behind it. They had running water, which was huge in the early 1800s. And they said President Polk came here, so this guy definitely had some political power and influence. But video isn't allowed inside, so you'll kind of just see images throughout the tour. The tour starts out in the area where the enslaved workers would have slept. They stayed in a separate building from the house. So in that building, today, there's a wall with the name of every slave that was documented working in the house. Being a literature student, I fully agree with this sign. I thought that this is a really nice part of the tour. Words have power. They express meanings, ideas, and relationships. They impact how we relate to the past and to one another. As we share this history, we strive to use words that are empathetic to those whose history has been marginalized. For example, we used phrases like enslaved woman rather than slave. The noun slave implies she was, at her core, a slave. The adjective enslaved reveals that though in bondage, bondage was not her core existence. Furthermore, she was enslaved by the actions of another. Therefore, we use terms like enslaver rather than master to indicate one's effort to exert power over another. You may hear other phrases like slave labor camp or escapee rather than plantation or runaway. These reinforce the idea of people's humanity rather than the conditions forced upon them. And I just love the way they explain this and the importance of acknowledging this. I mean, what do you think when you hear slave labor camp versus plantation? To me, that's a totally new phrase of a plantation being referenced as a slave labor camp, but in essence, that's what it was. So I really, really like the concept. Next, the tour enters the main building. I don't have great photos to share, but the architecture is pretty cool. There's a room that's purposely made round, turning the corners into small closets or walkways, and there's a harp inside to show the wealth of the family. So like I was saying before, this house has so much to it. In one sense, they were talking about escapees versus runaways, and just how the wordage is important to acknowledging history. And then on the other hand, it shows how grand this house is, like with these round walls. The floor is also cut out in an area to show the piping that allowed for running water to enter the house, which was extremely fancy during that time. So we just did the upstairs of the house and the outdoor carriage area, and I do understand why the descendants donated this house. It's actually beautifully designed, and yes, this was for a rich family that made money off of slavery, which is something that you also mentally can't forget at all. But this house is architecturally and engineering-wise really compelling. I mean, they have a bridge on their top floor that links, one side of the house to the other side of the house, which I've never seen before. So I do think this house, kind of talking about it before, yes, it's not necessarily meant to commemorate the family who did own slaves and slaves that lived here, but it's also to show, historically, to never forget on how divided we were, and and how we treated people so differently, and so, you know, like disrespectfully. They talk a lot about, you know, one of the enslaved women who took care of the children, throughout their whole lives, was eventually sent to jail by those same children, like 60 years later, or something like that. And you know, that in itself is mind-blowing, and I think it's so compelling to add to the story, in addition to appreciating the architecture of the house. So lots of layers and lots of things to think about when we, you know, spend our money at a place like this.
The Owens Thomas house is remarkable for its extensive indoor plumbing system, a technological marvel at the time. The plumbing system used rainwater captured from the roof and stored in cisterns on 3 different levels. Features included 3 marble bathtubs, 2 water closets, also called toilets, 1 shower, and multiple sinks. The sophisticated innovation of an indoor plumbing system changed the daily lives of the house's inhabitants in profound ways. For the Richardsons and Owenses, the system was a mark of elite social status, not to mention convenience. For the enslaved people in the house, the system meant less water to haul from the well and fewer chamber pots to empty. It also meant maintaining, cleaning, and repairing a one-of-a-kind plumbing system in a city without trained plumbers. It is unlikely that enslaved people, such as Emma or Peter, which they reference throughout the tour, used the flushing water closets or marble bathtubs. They likely used the 2-sided privy that was located in the workyard outside. Today, it's viewed as the garden, and bathed using buckets of water warmed by the fireplace in their sleeping quarters. So again, a lot to take in from this sign alone, imagining what life was like for multiple people who lived in this house. The basement of the house completes the tour and talks a lot more about the relationship between the people in the house. I found the dynamic to be really interesting, so here's some points that are listed. So these letters here talk about the relationship of people within the house. Emma was a nursemaid to the family that is writing these letters. So one of the nieces says in her letter to give her love to her family, and she also includes Emma. They also note that when Emma, the nursemaid, became sick, the Owens family brought Emma to Philadelphia from Savannah to try to get medical treatment. They also note in a letter that the Owens family put Emma in their will, so $100 went to Emma, but they also note that the ability to own and control any money or resources was subject to the restraints placed by the particular slave holder. So even once this Owens passes away, the new owner, the new slave holder, would control how Emma would use the money. And after this sign, it talks about how enslavers would threaten to break families at slave auctions. The information is extremely gut-wrenching. So overall, I think this house has a ton to offer. I was super impressed and just impacted from this tour. I enjoyed seeing the house from an engineering standpoint, but what made it also really impactful and worth my time and money is the insight into what allowed such a divide between humans. It's provoking and appalling at the same time. So thanks for watching. This was a little longer of a video than typical, but check back next week for another video.